So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, in this exact moment, you're doing something that no other species on this planet has ever done. You're lying there, comfortable. Maybe your eyes are closed, and you're listening to a stream of sounds, just vibrations in the air, really. And those vibrations are becoming ideas in your mind. Not simple ideas either. Complex, layered, abstract thoughts. You're hearing words you've never heard in this particular order before, and yet you understand them instantly, effortlessly, without even trying. You don't have to concentrate. You don't have to decode anything. It just happens. Language flows into you like water into a glass. And that, honestly, is one of the most extraordinary things in the entire history of life on Earth. Because for the vast, vast majority of the time that living creatures have existed on this planet, we're talking billions of years, nothing could do what you're doing right now. Nothing could take a thought from one mind and place it, intact, into another mind using structured sound. Bees can dance to show where flowers are. Whales can sing across oceans. Birds can call out warnings. But none of them can do what you and I are doing right now, which is to build a shared world of meaning, sentence by sentence, idea by idea, using an infinitely flexible system of symbols that we both just know. So tonight, let's talk about how that happened. How did we get here? How did human beings go from being just another primate on the African savanna, clever, sure, but not fundamentally different from a dozen other species, to being the only creature that tells stories, writes poetry, argues about politics, whispers, "I love you" in the dark? How did language begin? And how did it change everything? And I should tell you up front, nobody knows for certain how language started. That's one of the most fascinating things about this whole subject. We have theories, and some of them are really compelling. But the origin of language is one of the deepest unsolved puzzles in all of science. In 1866, the Linguistic Society of Paris actually banned papers on the origin of language because the speculation had gotten so wild and unproductive that they just threw up their hands. Banned it. Said, "We're not doing this anymore." That ban isn't in effect today, obviously, but it tells you something about how hard this question is. Language doesn't fossilize. You can dig up a 2-million-year-old skull and measure the brain case, but you can't dig up a conversation. You can't excavate a joke someone told around a fire 300,000 years ago. So, we have to be a little humble here. And we have to piece things together from indirect evidence, from anatomy, from archaeology, from genetics, from what we know about how the brain works, and from studying the languages that exist today and working backward. But let's start with what we do know, and let's start way, way back. Let's go back to before there were humans at all, about 6 or 7 million years ago. Somewhere in Africa, the lineage that would become us split off from the lineage that would become chimpanzees and bonobos. Now, chimps are smart, really smart. They use tools. They have complex social hierarchies. They can learn to use symbols in laboratory settings. There's a famous bonobo named Kanzi who learned to communicate using a board of lexicograms, geometric symbols that represent words. Kanzi could understand spoken English sentences and respond appropriately. He could ask for things. He could even combine symbols in novel ways. But here's the thing. Even Kanzi, even the most linguistically trained ape in history, never got beyond what you might call the language ability of a 2.5-year-old human child. He could label things. He could make requests. He could string a couple of concepts together. But he couldn't do syntax. He couldn't nest one idea inside another. He couldn't say something like, "The food that you hid behind the rock yesterday is probably gone by now." That kind of recursive, layered, time-traveling sentence, that's uniquely human. And that gap between what Kanzi can do and what a 4-year-old child can do effortlessly is the gap we need to explain. So what happened in those 6 or 7 million years? What changed in our brains, in our bodies, in our social lives that made language possible? Well, one of the first things to think about is the body itself. Because language isn't just a brain thing, it's a whole body thing. You need the right equipment. And humans have some very specific anatomical features that make speech possible, features that our primate cousins don't have. Start with the larynx, your voice box. In most mammals, the larynx sits high up in the throat, close to the nasal passage. That's actually useful because it means they can breathe and swallow at the same time. A horse can drink water and breathe simultaneously, very efficient. But in adult humans, the larynx has descended. It sits much lower in the throat, which creates this long resonating chamber called the pharynx above it. And that chamber is what gives us the ability to produce the incredible range of vowel sounds that human language requires. Think about the difference between the sound E and the sound oo. You're reshaping that pharyngeal space with your tongue and lips, and the descended larynx gives you enough room to create all those distinct vowel qualities. Without it, you'd be stuck with a much more limited palette of sounds. Now here's the trade-off, and this is one of those details that makes you appreciate how serious evolution was about language. Because the descended larynx means we can't breathe and swallow at the same time. That's why humans choke on food. We're the only primates that routinely choke to death on what we're eating. Every year, thousands of people die from choking. That's the price we pay for being able to talk. Evolution essentially said, the ability to produce complex speech sounds is so valuable that it's worth the risk of occasionally choking on a grape. Think about that for a second. Whatever advantage language gave us, it was so enormous that natural selection was willing to accept a real, lethal cost to get it. But the larynx is just one piece. You also need fine motor control of the tongue, which is this incredibly complex muscular organ. It's actually a group of 8 muscles that can move in almost any direction with extraordinary precision. Try saying the word electricity slowly and pay attention to what your tongue is doing. It's performing this elaborate dance, touching the roof of your mouth here, pulling back there, flicking forward, all in the space of a second or two. The neural control required for that is immense. And you need precise control of your breathing too, because speech requires you to modulate your airflow in ways that normal breathing doesn't demand. You have to push air out in controlled streams, varying the pressure to change volume and pitch, pausing at exactly the right moments. Your diaphragm and intercostal muscles, the muscles between your ribs, are doing incredibly fine-tuned work every time you speak a sentence. And then there's the brain itself. This is where it gets really interesting. There are 2 areas of the brain that have been associated with language for over 150 years now, and they were both discovered because of what happened when they were damaged. The first is Broca's area, named after Paul Broca, a French physician who in 1861 examined a patient known as ton. That was the only syllable the man could produce. Ton, ton, ton. That's all he could say. When the patient died, Broca examined his brain and found damage to a specific region in the left frontal lobe. He concluded that this area was responsible for speech production. And then, about a decade later, a German neurologist named Karl Wernicke identified a different area, further back in the left hemisphere, near the temporal lobe, that when damaged produced a completely different kind of language problem. Wernicke's patients could speak fluently. Their sentences had normal rhythm and intonation, but the words made no sense. They'd produce these flowing streams of grammatically structured nonsense. They could talk, but they couldn't mean anything, and they often couldn't understand what others were saying to them either. So you had this beautiful double dissociation. Damage in one spot, and you can understand but can't produce speech. Damage in another spot, and you can produce speech but can't understand it. That told scientists that language isn't just one thing in the brain. It's a system, with different components handling different aspects of the process. Now, we know today that the picture is much more complicated than just Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Modern brain imaging, fMRI, PET scans, that kind of thing, has shown that language activates huge networks across both hemispheres, involving regions that handle memory, emotion, motor planning, sensory processing, social cognition. Language is not neatly localized. It's distributed. It's woven into the fabric of almost everything your brain does. But those early discoveries by Broca and Wernicke were crucial because they established that language has a biological basis, that it lives in the physical structure of the brain, and that you can study it scientifically. So we've got the anatomy, the descended larynx, the nimble tongue, the breathing control, the specialized brain regions. But when did all of this come together? When did our ancestors actually start talking? And this is where we have to be honest and say, we don't know. We really don't. But we can look at the evidence and make some educated guesses. One important clue comes from a gene called FOXP2. In 2001, researchers at Oxford identified this gene by studying a family in London, the KE family, where about half the members across 3 generations had severe speech and language difficulties. They had trouble with the fine motor control of the mouth and face needed for speech, and they also had problems with grammar and language processing. The researchers traced the problem to a mutation in a single gene on chromosome 7, which they named FOXP2. Now, here's what's fascinating. When they compared the human version of FOXP2 to the version found in other primates, they found that the human version differs by just 2 amino acids from the chimpanzee version. 2 tiny changes, and when they estimated when those changes occurred, based on the rate of genetic mutation, they came up with a date of roughly 200,000 years ago, which is right around the time that anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared in Africa. That's suggestive. It doesn't prove that language started 200,000 years ago, and FOXP2 is certainly not the language gene. That's a massive oversimplification. It's involved in lots of things, including lung development and the fine motor control of the mouth. But the timing is intriguing. Other researchers think language, or at least something like language, might be much older than that. There's a case to be made that Homo heidelbergensis, a species that lived in Africa and Europe between about 700,000 and 200,000 years ago, might have had some form of speech. Their skulls show evidence of a brain size comparable to ours, and some fossils suggest their vocal tract anatomy was at least partway toward the modern configuration. And then there's Homo erectus, going back nearly 2 million years, who made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, and may have dispersed out of Africa in coordinated groups, all things that would seem a lot easier if you could talk to each other. But here's the counter-argument, and it's a good one. You can do a lot with gesture, with pointing, with demonstration, with grunts and cries and facial expressions. You don't necessarily need full-blown language to coordinate a hunt or teach someone to make a hand axe. You need communication, sure, But communication and language aren't the same thing. Every animal communicates. Language is something more specific. It's a system with rules, with grammar, with the ability to combine a finite set of elements into an infinite number of meaningful expressions. That's the magic trick. That's what makes it different from a vervet monkey's alarm call or a dog's growl. And one of the deepest questions in all of linguistics is whether that magic trick happened gradually, building up piece by piece over hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, or whether it happened relatively suddenly, some kind of cognitive revolution, a rewiring of the brain that flipped a switch and suddenly made syntactic language possible. Noam Chomsky, probably the most influential linguist of the 20th century, has leaned toward the sudden emergence view. He's argued that there's a core computational operation in the brain, he calls it merge, that allows you to take two concepts and combine them into a new, larger unit, and then take that unit and combine it with something else, and so on, recursively, infinitely. And he suggested that this capacity might have arisen from a single genetic mutation, perhaps in one individual, sometime in the last 100,000 years or so. It's a dramatic idea. One mutation, one individual, and suddenly the door to language swings open. Most other linguists and evolutionary biologists think that's too neat, too sudden. They favor a more gradual story, a proto-language stage, maybe starting with simple, word-like vocalizations, then slowly developing more structure, more complexity, more grammar, over tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. And honestly, we may never know which story is closer to the truth because the evidence is so sparse and so indirect. But what we can do is look at what happened after language arrived, however it arrived. Because once human beings could talk, once they could share ideas, coordinate plans, teach skills, tell stories, warn each other about dangers they hadn't personally witnessed, everything changed. And I mean everything. The pace of cultural evolution, which had been achingly slow for millions of years, suddenly accelerated. Tools got more sophisticated. Art appeared. Burial practices emerged, suggesting abstract thought about death and the afterlife. Trade networks stretched across hundreds of miles. And perhaps most importantly, knowledge could accumulate across generations in a way it never had before. A clever trick discovered by one person didn't die with them. It could be passed on, refined, built upon. Language made culture possible, and culture made civilization possible, and civilization made everything you see around you right now. That's the chain, and it's a chain that could not exist without language at its foundation. So let's sit with that for a moment, because it's easy to say, language made culture possible, and just nod along, but the mechanics of how that actually works are worth unpacking. Think about what life is like for a species that can't talk. You're a chimpanzee, say, and you figure out that if you strip the leaves off a twig and poke it into a termite mound, you can fish out a meal. That's genuinely clever. That's tool use. But how do you pass that knowledge on? Well, mostly through observation. A younger chimp watches you do it, tries it themselves, maybe gets the hang of it after a few attempts. That works, but it's slow, it's limited to whoever happens to be watching, and it's fragile. If the young chimp doesn't quite get the technique right, the knowledge degrades. There's no way to say, no. You've got to angle it slightly to the left and wait until you feel the termites grab on before you pull it out. You can't give instructions. You can't explain the why behind the technique. You can demonstrate, and that's about it. Now imagine you can talk. Suddenly, You can teach the technique to someone who's never even seen a termite mound. You can describe what to look for, how to prepare the twig, what mistakes to avoid. You can teach 10 people at once. You can teach someone who will then walk 3 days to another group and teach them. And here's what's really crucial. You can teach the next generation not just the technique itself, but the improvements you've made to it. Your grandmother figured out the basic method. Your mother discovered that a certain kind of bark works better than a twig. You realized that if you wet the end slightly, more termites stick to it. Each generation adds a layer. That's cumulative culture. And it is, as far as we can tell, almost entirely unique to humans. Other species have culture in a loose sense. They have learned behaviors that vary from group to group, but they don't really build on those behaviors across generations the way we do. They don't ratchet upward. We do. And the ratchet is language. Now, here's where the archaeological record starts to get really interesting, because you can actually see the moment. Well, not the moment, more like the era, when this ratcheting effect seems to kick in. For most of the time that hominins have been making stone tools, the progress was almost unimaginably slow. The Oldowan toolkit, basically rough choppers and flakes, first appeared around 2.5 million years ago and persisted with minimal change for nearly 1 million years. Then the Acheulean hand axe shows up, which is a genuine leap in sophistication, a beautifully symmetrical, teardrop-shaped tool that required real planning and skill to produce. But even the Acheulean tradition lasted for over 1 million years with relatively modest variation. 1 million years of essentially the same hand axe design. Try to wrap your head around that. 1 million years, and then something changes, starting roughly 300,000 years ago and really accelerating after about 100,000 years ago. The toolkit starts diversifying rapidly. You get specialized tools, scrapers, awls, blades, points designed for specific tasks. You get composite tools, where a stone point is hafted onto a wooden shaft to make a spear. You get tools made from bone and antler. You get regional variation, meaning different groups in different places are developing their own distinctive styles and techniques. The pace of innovation is just completely different from anything that came before. And a lot of researchers think this acceleration lines up, roughly, with the emergence of fully modern language. It's not proof. Correlation isn't causation, as they say, but it's suggestive. Once people could talk about what they were making, could discuss technique, could plan a tool before they started knapping the stone, the whole process of innovation sped up dramatically. And tools are just the beginning. Think about what else language enables. Coordination, for one. If you're hunting a large animal, a mammoth, say, or even a fast-moving deer, you need a plan. You need people in specific positions. You need signals. You need to be able to say, "You go around that way, I'll drive it towards you, and when it reaches the clearing, we both throw." That kind of coordinated group hunting is extraordinarily difficult without language, and it's probably no coincidence that evidence for large-scale cooperative hunting increases right around the time we think language was becoming more sophisticated. Then there's social organization. Once you can talk, you can negotiate, you can form alliances, you can gossip. And don't underestimate gossip, because the anthropologist Robin Dunbar has argued that gossip is actually one of the primary functions language evolved to serve. His idea, which he laid out in the mid-1990s, is that language essentially replaced grooming as the main mechanism for social bonding in large groups. In primate societies, you maintain relationships through physical grooming, picking through each other's fur, basically. It's intimate. It builds trust. It reinforces social bonds. but it's incredibly time-consuming, and you can only groom one individual at a time. As hominin groups got larger, and they did get larger, probably because larger groups were better at defending territory and finding food, the old grooming-based system couldn't scale. You'd need to spend an impossible percentage of your day grooming to maintain all your relationships. Language solved that problem. You can talk to several people at once. You can bond over shared stories, shared complaints, shared laughter. And crucially, you can exchange social information. Who's trustworthy? Who's cheating? Who's a good ally? Who's dangerous? That's gossip. And Dunbar thinks it's not a trivial side effect of language, but one of the driving forces behind its evolution. It's a fascinating idea, and whether or not it's the whole story, it highlights something important. Language isn't just about transmitting practical information. It's about building and maintaining the social fabric that holds groups together. And as groups got larger and more complex, that social fabric needed to be stronger and more flexible. Language provided that. Now let's talk about something that might seem like a detour, but it's really not. Let's talk about art. Because some of the earliest evidence we have for what you might call symbolic thinking, the ability to let one thing stand for another, which is absolutely fundamental to language, comes from art and personal ornamentation. In Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, archaeologists have found pieces of ochre with geometric patterns scratched into them, dating back about 77,000 years. They've found shell beads that were clearly strung together as necklaces or bracelets. These aren't tools. They're not practical objects. They're symbols. The patterns on the ochre might be decorative, or they might mean something. We'll probably never know exactly what. But the fact that someone sat down and deliberately inscribed a crosshatch pattern onto a piece of mineral pigment tells you that their mind was working in a symbolic register. They could think abstractly. They could create representations. And this matters for our story because language is, at its core, a symbolic system. Every word is a symbol, an arbitrary sound that stands for a concept. The word tree doesn't look like a tree or sound like a tree. It's just a noise we've all agreed refers to that tall thing with the trunk and the leaves. That agreement, that shared convention, requires exactly the kind of symbolic thinking that's on display at Blombos Cave. So when we see evidence of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record, we're probably also seeing evidence of a mind that's capable of language, even if we can't hear the words they were saying. The cave paintings are even more spectacular, of course. The ones at Chauvet in southern France, dating back about 36,000 years, are breathtaking. Lions, horses, rhinoceroses, rendered with a skill and a dynamism that still impresses artists today. And then Lascaux, about 17,000 years ago, and Altamira in Spain, and dozens of other sites across Europe, Southeast Asia, Indonesia. The paintings in Sulawesi, Indonesia, have been dated to at least 45,000 years ago, making them among the oldest known figurative art anywhere in the world. These aren't doodles. These are sophisticated compositions created by people with rich inner lives, people who could plan, who could represent the world around them, who almost certainly could talk about what they were painting and why. But here's something to think about as you're lying there. All of this, the tools, the art, the beads, the burial practices, the trade networks, all of this is indirect evidence. We're inferring the presence of language from its downstream effects because language itself leaves no fossil. Sound doesn't fossilize. Words don't preserve in sediment. We can find a hyoid bone and say, this individual probably had the anatomy for speech. We can find a painted cave wall and say, this individual probably had the cognitive capacity for symbolic thought. But we can never find a sentence. We can never find a conversation. The oldest actual evidence of language, language we can read, language we can decode, doesn't come until writing appears. And writing is shockingly recent. Think about this. Modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years. Language, in some form, has probably existed for at least 100,000 years, maybe much longer. But writing? Writing is only about 5,000 years old. That means for something like 95% of the time humans have had language, they had no way to write it down. Every story, every law, every recipe, every genealogy, every piece of accumulated wisdom, all of it was stored in human memory and transmitted through human speech. Oral tradition. And oral tradition is remarkable in what it can preserve, but it's also inherently fragile, inherently mutable. Stories change in the retelling, details shift, names get swapped, the telephone game played across centuries. So when writing finally does appear, it's not just a new technology. It's a revolution in what language can do. It's the moment language breaks free from the limitations of human memory and human lifespan. And the story of how that happened, how human beings figured out how to make marks on a surface that could capture speech and hold it there, permanently, for anyone to read, even thousands of years later. That story starts in a place you might not expect. It starts with accounting, with commerce, with the deeply unglamorous need to keep track of how many bags of grain you owed somebody. Because the first writing wasn't poetry, wasn't mythology, wasn't philosophy. It was bookkeeping. And the place where it happened was southern Mesopotamia. The land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in what is now modern-day Iraq. And the people who did it were the Sumerians. Now Sumer, around 3400 BCE, was not some backwater. It was one of the most complex societies on Earth at the time. Cities like Uruk, which may have had 40,000 people or more at its peak, were bustling with trade, agriculture, temple administration, and all the logistical headaches that come with thousands of humans trying to live together in one place. And here's the problem they ran into. When your village has 50 people, you can remember who owes what to whom. You can settle disputes with a conversation. But when your city has tens of thousands of people, and your temple is collecting grain taxes from hundreds of farmers, and you're distributing rations to workers, and you're trading with merchants from other cities, you simply cannot hold all of that in your head anymore. Memory isn't enough. You need a system. And the system they came up with, the very first step, wasn't even writing in the way we'd recognize it. It was clay tokens, small shaped pieces of clay, cones, spheres, discs, cylinders, each shape representing a specific commodity. A cone might mean a small measure of barley. A sphere might mean a larger measure. A cylinder might represent an animal. These tokens date back to at least 8,000 BCE, so they're ancient, even by the standards of early civilization. For thousands of years, people used them as a kind of physical accounting system. You'd keep your tokens in a container, and the collection of tokens represented what you had, or what you owed, or what had been delivered. But then something clever happened. Around 3,500 BCE, give or take, people started sealing groups of tokens inside hollow clay balls called bulli. You'd put the tokens inside, seal it up, and the sealed ball served as a kind of tamper-proof record. If there was a dispute, you could break the ball open and count the tokens. But here's the issue. You can't see what's inside without breaking it. So someone had the bright idea of pressing the tokens into the outside surface of the ball before sealing them inside. That way, you could read the impressions on the surface without destroying the record. And right there, right at that moment, you've got something remarkable happening. You've got marks on a clay surface that represent quantities of goods. You've got symbols standing in for real things. The tokens inside become redundant. Why bother with the tokens at all when the impressions on the surface carry the same information? And that's essentially what happened. The tokens gradually disappeared, and what remained were marks pressed or scratched into flat clay tablets. The earliest of these tablets, from Uruk, dating to around 3400 to 3200 BCE, are covered in pictographic symbols, little pictures of things. A drawing of a head meant head. A drawing of a bowl meant food or to eat. A drawing of a foot meant to walk or to stand. These are the earliest known examples of what we call proto-cuneiform, and they're almost entirely administrative. Lists of goods, quantities of barley, numbers of livestock, worker rations. It's spreadsheets. The very first written documents in human history are essentially spreadsheets. There's something both humbling and kind of wonderful about that. We tend to imagine writing beginning with something grand, a creation myth, a love poem, a philosophical treatise. But no, it begins with somebody needing to know how many goats were delivered to the temple last Tuesday. The poetry comes later. The philosophy comes much later. First, you count the goats. But here's where it gets really interesting, because those early pictographic symbols had a problem. They could represent concrete, visible things pretty well. A fish, a cow, a jar of beer. But how do you draw an abstract concept? How do you draw freedom? How do you draw yesterday? How do you draw someone's name? This is the fundamental limitation of pictographic writing, and cracking it open required one of the most ingenious cognitive leaps in human history. It's called the rebus principle, and it works like this. Imagine you're a Sumerian scribe, and you need to write the word for life. The Sumerian word for life is T, but you can't draw life. It's abstract. However, the Sumerian word for arrow is also T, and you absolutely can draw an arrow. So you use the picture of an arrow to represent not the object arrow, but the sound T. And now that symbol means life. You've detached the symbol from its original meaning and attached it to a sound. That is a monumental shift. That's the moment. Writing stops being a collection of little pictures and starts becoming a system that can represent language itself. Any word, any idea, any sound that a human voice can produce. This transition didn't happen overnight. It took centuries. Gradually, over the period from roughly 3,200 to 2,600 BCE, Sumerian writing evolved from those early pictographs into the system we call cuneiform, named from the Latin cunus, meaning wedge, because scribes pressed a wedge-shaped reed stylus into soft clay, creating those distinctive wedge-shaped marks. The original pictures became increasingly abstract and stylized. A picture that once clearly looked like a fish became a collection of wedge impressions that bore no visual resemblance to a fish at all. But it didn't matter, because the symbol's meaning was now carried by convention, by learned association, not by visual resemblance. The writing system had become truly symbolic, and cuneiform turned out to be extraordinarily versatile. It was adapted to write not just Sumerian, but Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, Elamite. A whole family of languages across the ancient Near East used cuneiform for over 3,000 years. Think about that longevity. 3,000 years. That's longer than the Latin alphabet has been in use. Cuneiform was the dominant writing technology for a vast stretch of human civilization. Meanwhile, And this is one of those fascinating parallel stories. Something completely different was happening in Egypt. Around roughly the same time, maybe slightly later, maybe independently, maybe with some cross-pollination of the idea, if not the specific system, the Egyptians developed hieroglyphics. And Egyptian hieroglyphics are interesting because they never fully abandoned the pictographic element the way cuneiform did. Hieroglyphs remained visually beautiful, recognizable pictures, an owl, a reed, a seated figure, a snake, even as they functioned phonetically. The Egyptians used a mix of logographic signs, where one symbol represents a whole word, and phonetic signs, where symbols represent sounds, and determinatives, which are unpronounced signs added to clarify meaning. It's a complex, layered system, and it worked brilliantly for over 3 millennia. But here's something worth pausing on. Both cuneiform and hieroglyphics are hard, really hard. Learning to read and write either system required years of training. In Mesopotamia, scribes trained in special schools called edubas, literally tablet houses, starting as children and studying for years to master the hundreds of signs they needed. In Egypt, scribal training was similarly rigorous and similarly exclusive. Literacy in these early civilizations was never widespread. It was a professional skill, possessed by maybe 1 or 2% of the population at most. Writing was powerful, but it was the tool of elites, priests, administrators, royal courts. The vast majority of people still lived in a world of purely oral communication, and that's actually an important thing to sit with. Writing didn't democratize language, not at first. For thousands of years, it actually did the opposite. It created a new kind of power, the power of the literate over the illiterate, the power of the record keeper over the person whose debts were being recorded. If you couldn't read the tablet, you had to trust the scribe. And scribes worked for the temple or the palace. There's a reason that in so many ancient cultures, writing was associated with the divine, with magic, with sacred knowledge. The Egyptian word for hieroglyphics literally translates to the words of God. Literacy was power, and power was closely guarded. Now, something happened that began to change this equation, and it happened on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, in the land of the Phoenicians, around 1050 BCE. The Phoenicians were traders, sailors, merchants who operated across the entire Mediterranean world, and they needed a writing system that was simpler, faster, more practical than the elaborate systems of their neighbors. What they developed, building on earlier experiments in the Sinai Peninsula and the Levant going back a few centuries, was an alphabet, or more precisely, an abjad, a consonantal alphabet, where each symbol represents a single consonant sound. And here's what's revolutionary about this. Instead of hundreds or thousands of symbols, the Phoenician alphabet had about 22 symbols, and you could write any word in the language. The learning curve dropped dramatically. You didn't need years of scribal training. A merchant could learn this system in weeks. A sailor could scratch a message on a potsherd. Writing became, for the first time, genuinely accessible to ordinary people. The Phoenician alphabet spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. The Greeks adopted it and made one crucial modification. Phoenician, like other Semitic languages, could function without written vowels because the consonantal skeleton of words carries most of the meaning. But Greek couldn't work that way. So the Greeks took several Phoenician consonant letters that represented sounds Greek didn't use and repurposed them as vowels. Alpha, epsilon, iota, omicron, upsilon. And with that adaptation, you had the first true alphabet. a system that represented both consonants and vowels, capable of capturing the full sound of spoken language with remarkable precision. From Greek came Etruscan, and from Etruscan came Latin, and from Latin came the alphabet you're listening to me use right now. The letters on every English page, every French sign, every Spanish novel, they trace their ancestry back through Latin, through Etruscan, through Greek, all the way to those Phoenician traders scratching consonants onto clay and stone 3,000 years ago. And on another branch, the Greek alphabet gave rise to Cyrillic, used today for Russian, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Serbian. The Phoenician system also influenced Aramaic, which in turn influenced Hebrew and Arabic scripts. The family tree is vast, and nearly every alphabetic writing system on Earth today connects back to that same root. But while the alphabet was spreading westward across the Mediterranean, something entirely different was happening in the East. In China, writing developed along a completely independent path, one that never made the jump to an alphabet, and for reasons that are genuinely fascinating and deeply tied to the nature of the Chinese language itself. The earliest Chinese writing we've found comes from the Shang dynasty, roughly 1200 BCE, inscribed on oracle bones. The shoulder blades of oxen and the shells of turtles used for divination. A question would be carved into the bone would be heated until it cracked, and the pattern of cracks would be interpreted as an answer from the spirits. And the writing on these bones is already sophisticated, already a mature system with thousands of characters, which means its origins must go back even further, probably centuries further, into periods we simply don't have records for yet. Chinese characters work fundamentally differently from alphabetic writing. Each character represents a morpheme, a unit of meaning, rather than a sound. The character for tree looks in its ancient form like a stylized tree. 2 trees together mean forest. 3 trees mean dense forest. A character showing the sun behind a tree means east, where the sun rises behind the trees. It's a system of extraordinary elegance, and it has one property that turned out to be profoundly important for Chinese civilization. Because the characters represent meanings rather than sounds, they can be read by speakers of mutually unintelligible Chinese dialects. A person speaking Cantonese and a person speaking Mandarin cannot understand each other's speech, but they can read the same text. The writing system became a unifying force across an enormous, linguistically diverse empire, and that's one of the key reasons it was never replaced by an alphabet. The logographic system served a political and cultural function that an alphabet simply couldn't replicate. So by roughly 2,000 years ago, you've got these major writing traditions established and spreading. Cuneiform fading in the Near East, replaced by alphabetic scripts. Hieroglyphics giving way to Demotic and then to Greek in Egypt. The Phoenician-derived alphabets proliferating across Europe and Western Asia. Chinese characters anchoring civilization in the East. And other independent or semi-independent traditions emerging in places like the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and elsewhere. Writing had gone from a bookkeeping tool in one Mesopotamian city to a global phenomenon, reshaping every society it touched. But writing, for all its power, still had a bottleneck. Every copy of every text had to be made by hand. One scribe, one stylus or pen or brush, one painstaking copy at a time. A single book might take months to produce. Libraries were treasures because each scroll or codex represented an enormous investment of human labor. And that bottleneck meant that even with alphabetic writing, even with simplified scripts, the spread of knowledge was still limited by how fast a human hand could move across a page. The next great revolution in language technology would have to solve that problem. And the story of how it was solved begins, perhaps surprisingly, not with Gutenberg in 15th century Germany, but with innovations in East Asia centuries earlier, with woodblock printing in Tang Dynasty China, with movable type made of ceramic in Song Dynasty China by a man named Bi Sheng around 1040 CE, and with the metal movable type developed in Korea in the 13th century. These are the precursors, the early experiments, and the story of how the idea of mechanical reproduction of text traveled, evolved, and eventually transformed the world, is one of those threads in history that you can pull on for a long time before you reach the end. So let's start in China, because that's where the story really begins. Woodblock printing emerged during the Tang Dynasty, roughly the 7th century CE, though the earliest surviving printed book, and this is a beautiful detail, is a copy of the Diamond Sutra, a Buddhist text dated precisely to 868 CE. It was found in a cave near Dunhuang in northwestern China in 1900, and it's stunning. It's a scroll about 16 feet long with intricate illustrations, and at the end there's a little colophon that says, essentially, printed for free distribution by Wang Ji on behalf of his parents. Think about that. The oldest surviving printed book in the world was made as an act of devotion, a gift, something meant to be shared. And the quality of the printing is so high that scholars are certain the technique had already been refined over many decades, maybe centuries, before this particular copy was made. The process itself is straightforward in concept, but painstaking in practice. You take a block of wood, usually pear or jujube wood because the grain is fine and even. You write your text on thin paper, paste it face down onto the block, and then carve away everything that isn't part of the characters. What you're left with is a relief. The text stands up from the surface. You ink the block, press paper onto it, and you've got a printed page. One block, one page. But here's the thing. Once you've carved that block, you can print hundreds, even thousands of copies from it. The bottleneck shifts from copying to carving, and carving a single block might take a skilled craftsman days, but those days of labor could then produce more copies than a scribe could make in a lifetime. This was transformative for Chinese culture. Buddhist monasteries became major printing centers, churning out sutras and religious texts. The government got involved too, printing official calendars, examination texts, even paper money. By the Song Dynasty, which began in 960 CE, China had a thriving commercial publishing industry. Bookshops in cities like Hangzhou and Kaifeng sold everything from classics and poetry to agricultural manuals and medical texts. And this is centuries before Europe had anything comparable. Centuries. Now, Bi Sheng. He's one of those figures in history who we know about almost entirely from a single source, a book called Dream Pool Essays by the polymath Shen Kuo, written around 1088 CE. Shen Kuo describes how Bai Sheng, a commoner, an artisan, invented movable type around 1040 CE. The idea was brilliant. Instead of carving a whole page onto one block, you make individual characters out of clay, fire them so they harden, and then arrange them in an iron frame to compose a page. You set the characters in a bed of resin and wax, heat the frame so the wax softens, press a flat board on top to level everything, let it cool, and the characters are locked in place. Print your pages, then heat the frame again, pop the characters out, and rearrange them for the next page. It's genuinely clever engineering. But here's where the practical reality gets complicated, and this is important for understanding why movable type didn't revolutionize China the way it would later revolutionize Europe. Chinese writing uses thousands of distinct characters. A literate person might know somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000, and a comprehensive set could include tens of thousands. To make movable type practical, you'd need an enormous inventory of individual character pieces, multiple copies of common characters, fewer of rare ones. Shen Kuo describes Bi Sheng having several sets of each character, and for rarely used characters, cutting them on the spot. The logistics of sorting, storing, and retrieving thousands of tiny clay pieces were daunting. Contrast that with an alphabetic script like Latin, where you need maybe 50 or 60 distinct pieces, upper and lowercase letters, punctuation, a few ligatures, and you can compose any word in the language. The alphabet, that Phoenician invention we talked about earlier, turned out to have an unexpected advantage that nobody could have predicted when those traders in Byblos first scratched their consonants onto pottery. It made movable type vastly more practical, so movable type in China remained a niche technique. Woodblock printing continued to dominate because, for a logographic script, it was actually more efficient in many cases. You carve the block once, store it, and reprint whenever you need more copies. The Koreans, though, took the idea further. In the 13th century, during the Goryeo dynasty, Korean craftsmen developed metal movable type, cast in bronze rather than molded in clay. The oldest known book printed with metal movable type is a Korean Buddhist text called the Jikji, printed in 1377, a full 78 years before Gutenberg's famous Bible. Korean is written with a different script, Hangul, which was actually invented later, in 1443, by King Sejong the Great, specifically because Chinese characters were too difficult for ordinary Koreans to learn. But even before Hangul, the Koreans were experimenting with metal type for Chinese characters, and the technology was sophisticated. The metal type was more durable than clay, produced sharper impressions, and could be reused almost indefinitely. But again, the impact was limited. Printing in Korea remained largely a court and monastic activity. The combination of a complex writing system, limited demand, and the expense of metal casting kept it from becoming a mass technology. And this is a pattern you see over and over in the history of technology. An invention can exist for a long time without transforming society if the surrounding conditions aren't right. The technology needs to meet the moment, and in 15th century Europe, the moment was right. Johannes Gutenberg, born around 1400 in Mainz, Germany, was a goldsmith by training. And that detail matters enormously, because what Gutenberg brought to printing wasn't just the idea of movable type. That idea, as we've seen, had existed in Asia for centuries, and it's debated whether Gutenberg knew about it or reinvented it independently. What Gutenberg brought was a complete system, an integrated technology that solved multiple problems at once, and his goldsmithing skills were central to every piece of it. Here's what he actually did, and this is where it gets really satisfying from an engineering perspective. First, the type itself. Gutenberg developed a hand mold, a precision device that let him cast individual letters quickly and uniformly from a lead-tin antimony alloy. The alloy was crucial. It had a low melting point, so it was easy to cast. It expanded slightly as it cooled, which meant it filled the mold precisely and produced sharp, clean letter forms. And it was hard enough to withstand the pressure of repeated printing without deforming. Each letter was cast on a rectangular shank of uniform height, so that when you lined them up in a frame, all the printing surfaces sat at exactly the same level. This is called type height, and getting it consistent was essential. If one letter sat even slightly higher than its neighbors, it would print darker or smudge, and if it sat lower, it wouldn't print at all. Second, the ink. Traditional water-based inks, the kind used in woodblock printing, didn't adhere well to metal type. Gutenberg developed an oil-based ink, drawing on the techniques of oil painters, that clung to the metal surfaces and transferred cleanly to paper or vellum. It's a small detail, but without the right ink, the whole system falls apart. Third, and maybe most importantly, the press itself. Gutenberg adapted the screw press, a device that had been used for centuries to press olives and grapes, into a printing press. The principle is simple. A large wooden screw, turned by a lever, drives a flat plate called the platen down onto the paper, which sits on top of the inked type. The screw press provides enormous, even pressure across the entire page, and it does so in a controlled, repeatable way. One pull of the lever, one printed page. A skilled operator could produce something like 250 impressions per hour. Compare that to a scribe who might take a full day to copy a single page of dense text. And here's what's really clever about the whole system. It's modular. You cast the type, compose a page, lock it into the frame, print as many copies as you want, then break up the type and reuse the letters for the next page. The Latin alphabet, with its small set of characters, made this wildly efficient. A print shop might need a few thousand individual pieces of type to keep multiple pages in composition at once, but those same pieces could produce an infinite variety of texts. The investment was in the equipment, not in the content. Gutenberg spent years perfecting this system, working in secrecy, burning through money. He borrowed heavily from a Mainz businessman named Johann Fust, and this is one of those human stories that gives the history its edge. Gutenberg was a perfectionist and a terrible businessman. He kept tinkering, kept refining, kept spending. Around 1452, he began work on his masterpiece, the 42-line Bible, so called because most pages have 42 lines of text. It's a breathtaking piece of work. The type is crisp and even. The layout is elegant, and Gutenberg went to extraordinary lengths to make the printed pages look like the work of a master scribe, including hand-rubricated initials and careful justification of the text margins. He printed about 180 copies, some on paper, some on vellum. Each one required the skins of around 170 calves for the vellum alone. But before the Bibles were finished, Fust sued him. The loans had come due, Gutenberg couldn't pay, and in 1455, a court awarded Fust control of the printing equipment and the work in progress. Fust partnered with Gutenberg's former assistant, Peter Schoeffer, and they completed and sold the Bibles. Gutenberg, the inventor, was essentially pushed out of his own revolution. He continued printing on a smaller scale, but he never regained his position, and he died in 1468 in relative obscurity. It's one of those stories that's hard to hear. The person who changes everything doesn't get to enjoy the change, but the technology itself exploded. Within decades, printing presses spread across Europe like wildfire. By 1500, just 50 years after the Gutenberg Bible, an estimated 20 million volumes had been printed across the continent. Some scholars put the number even higher. Think about what that means. For all of prior human history, every single written document had been copied by hand. And then, in half a century, more books were produced than all the scribes in Europe had created in the previous 1,000 years combined. The cost of books plummeted. A text that might have cost a year's wages for a laborer could now be had for a fraction of that. And as books became cheaper, literacy became more valuable, which drove demand for education, which created more readers, which created more demand for books. It was a feedback loop, and it was self-reinforcing in a way that nobody could have predicted and nobody could stop. Once you had cheap books, you had a world that was fundamentally different from the one that came before, and there was no going back. Let's sit with that for a moment, because the consequences of this feedback loop are so vast that it's easy to just wave your hand and say, printing changed everything, without really feeling the weight of what that means. So let's trace some of the specific ways it reshaped human civilization, because they're remarkable, and they connect directly to how you and I use language right now, tonight. The first and maybe most obvious consequence was the standardization of languages themselves. Before printing, there was no such thing as correct spelling. Think about that. If you were a scribe in 14th century England, you spelled words however they sounded to you, in your particular dialect, with your particular habits. The word church might be spelled 6 different ways in 6 different manuscripts, and nobody thought that was a problem, because there was no authority to say otherwise. Every copy of a text was slightly different, not just in spelling, but in phrasing, in word choice, sometimes in meaning. Languages were fluid, local, constantly shifting from village to village. But when a printer in London set type for a book, that printer had to make choices. How do you spell this word? Which form of the verb do you use? Which regional expression do you pick? And whatever choices the printer made got replicated identically across hundreds or thousands of copies and distributed to readers all over the country. For the first time, large numbers of people were reading the exact same words on the exact same pages. And the dialect that tended to win was the dialect of wherever the printing press was located, which usually meant the capital city or a major commercial center. In England, that meant London English. In France, Parisian French. In Spain, Castilian. Printing didn't just spread language, it froze it. It took the living, shifting, wonderfully chaotic mess of spoken dialects and began pressing them into a mold. This is actually a little bittersweet, if you think about it. Standardization brought enormous benefits: mutual intelligibility across regions, the possibility of national literature, the foundation for modern education. But it also began the slow erosion of countless local dialects and minority languages that had thrived for centuries. The language of the printing press became the prestige language, and everything else gradually became uneducated speech, something to be corrected rather than celebrated. That tension between standardization and linguistic diversity is still with us today, and it started right here with Gutenberg's movable type. Now, here's where it gets really interesting from a political and religious standpoint. Remember, in the early 1500s, the Catholic Church held enormous power across Europe, and one of the pillars of that power was control over the text of the Bible. The Bible was in Latin, the language of the Church, and ordinary people couldn't read it. They depended on priests to interpret Scripture for them. That's not an accident. It's a power structure built on restricted access to information. And then along comes Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, or so the legend goes. Some historians question whether he literally nailed them or simply sent them to the Archbishop of Mainz. But either way, what matters is what happened next. Luther's arguments against church practices, like the sale of indulgences, were printed, not copied by hand in some monastery, printed, Within weeks, copies had spread across Germany. Within months, across Europe. Luther himself was reportedly astonished at the speed. He later said something to the effect that printing was God's highest act of grace, and you can understand why he felt that way, because without the press, his ideas would have circulated slowly, locally, and the church would have had time to suppress them. Instead, they went viral. And yes, that's exactly the right modern word for it, because the mechanism is the same: rapid, uncontrollable replication. But Luther didn't stop with theological arguments. In 1522, he published his German translation of the New Testament, the so-called September Testament, because it came out in September, and it sold about 5,000 copies in just 2 months. That's an enormous print run for the time. And it was written not in the formal, distant language of scholars, but in the common German that ordinary people actually spoke. Luther reportedly said he wanted to listen to the mother in her home, the children in the street, the common man in the market, and translate accordingly. He wanted the Bible to sound like real speech. And here's the kicker. Luther's translation didn't just spread Protestant theology. It helped create modern Standard German. Just as London printers were standardizing English, Luther's Bible became the linguistic reference point for German-speaking people across dozens of different dialect regions. His word choices, his phrasings, his rhythms seeped into the language itself. When people today speak Standard High German, they're speaking, in part, a language that was shaped by one monk's decision about how to translate ancient Greek and Hebrew into the words of ordinary 16th century Germans. Language, religion, politics, technology, they're all tangled together, and you can't pull on one thread without moving all the others. The same pattern played out in England with William Tyndale, who began translating the Bible into English around 1525. Tyndale had to flee to the continent to do his work because it was illegal in England to translate scripture without church approval. He printed his English New Testament in Germany and had copies smuggled back to England in bales of cloth. The church authorities were furious. They bought up copies to burn them, which, and this is almost comically ironic, actually helped finance Tyndale's further printing, because the money from those purchases went right back into producing more copies. Tyndale was eventually betrayed, arrested, and in 1536, strangled and burned at the stake near Brussels. His reported last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." And here's the thing. Within a few years, Henry VIII authorized an English Bible to be placed in every church in England. Much of it was based on Tyndale's translation. Many of the phrases you know from the King James Bible of 1611, "Let there be light," "the salt of the earth," "the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Those are Tyndale's words. A man executed as a heretic gave the English language some of its most enduring expressions. His phrases are so deeply embedded in English that you use them without knowing where they came from. That's the power of print. It can take one person's words and make them immortal, even when the person themselves is destroyed. So printing didn't just make more books. It restructured power. It standardized languages. It enabled the Reformation. It created the conditions for the scientific revolution, because suddenly researchers could publish their findings and know that hundreds of other researchers across Europe would read the exact same text, the exact same diagrams, the exact same data. Before printing, scientific knowledge was fragmented. One scholar in Padua might spend years working on a problem that had already been solved by someone in Prague, and neither would ever know. After printing, knowledge became cumulative in a way it had never been before. Isaac Newton's famous line about standing on the shoulders of giants isn't just modesty. It's a literal description of what print made possible. You could read everything that came before you, build on it, and publish your additions for the next person to build on in turn. And this brings us to something that might seem like a small technical detail, but turns out to be enormously important. The question of how languages handle the relationship between sounds and symbols as they spread through print and across borders and through time. Because here's a problem that printing created, or at least made visible. When you standardize spelling through print, you freeze the written form of a word at a particular moment. But spoken language keeps changing. People keep shifting their vowels, dropping consonants, merging sounds. So over time, a gap opens up between how a word is spelled and how it's actually pronounced. English is probably the most extreme example of this. Think about the word night. You spell it Knight, but you say night. At one point, English speakers actually pronounced that K, that hard G, that guttural sound in the middle. But pronunciation shifted. This was part of what linguists call the Great Vowel Shift, a massive reorganization of English vowel sounds that happened roughly between 1400 and 1700, and spelling, locked in by print, didn't keep up. That's why English spelling is such a nightmare. It's not that the system is irrational, it's that it's a fossil record. It preserves the sounds of a language that no longer exists in spoken form. Other languages handled this differently. Spanish, for instance, underwent periodic spelling reforms that kept its orthography relatively close to its pronunciation. When you see a Spanish word, you can generally pronounce it correctly, even if you've never seen it before. Italian is similar. But English and French both accumulated enormous gaps between spelling and sound, partly because their spelling was standardized early by print and then left largely unchanged even as the spoken language evolved. And this matters. It matters practically, right now, tonight, because it affects how easy or hard it is to learn to read. Research in the late 20th and early 21st centuries has shown that children learning to read in languages with transparent orthographies, languages where spelling maps consistently onto sound, learn to decode text much faster than children learning to read English. An Italian child or a Finnish child can typically read aloud with reasonable accuracy within a few months of starting school. English-speaking children often struggle for years, and a significant portion develop what we call dyslexia, which some researchers argue is partly an artifact of the writing system itself rather than a purely neurological condition. The opacity of English spelling creates a higher bar for reading, and that bar was set in large part by decisions that printers made 500 years ago. You're living with the consequences of Caxton's choices. William Caxton, who set up the first printing press in England in 1476, and whose spelling conventions, influenced by the Flemish typesetters he'd worked with in Bruges, became baked into the language. So language, by this point in our story, let's say the 16th and 17th centuries, has become something very different from what it was when we started. It began as breath and gesture, as sound shaped by tongues and teeth in the mouths of early humans on the African savanna. It became symbol, scratched into clay in Mesopotamia. It became alphabet, refined by Phoenician traders and Greek philosophers. And now it had become product, something manufactured, distributed, sold, regulated, fought over. Language was no longer just a thing people did. It was a thing people owned, controlled, and weaponized. And that weaponization was about to intensify dramatically because the age of European colonialism was getting underway, and wherever colonial powers went, they brought their languages with them, sometimes as tools of administration, sometimes as instruments of deliberate cultural erasure. the story of how European languages spread across the globe and what happened to the thousands of languages they encountered along the way, is one of the most consequential and most painful chapters in the entire history of human communication. And it starts with something that might surprise you. It starts with maps. Specifically, it starts with the linguistic maps that colonial administrators drew, not of the territories they were conquering, but of the languages spoken in those territories. Because before you can replace a language, you first have to know what you're replacing. And those early colonial linguists, many of them missionaries, produced some of the first systematic grammars and dictionaries of languages that had never been written down before. There's a deep irony here. Some of the best records we have of languages that colonialism would go on to destroy were created by the very people whose arrival set that destruction in motion. Take the Spanish in the Americas. When Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, the Aztec Empire alone encompassed dozens of languages, with Nahuatl serving as a lingua franca across a vast trading network. Within a generation of the conquest, Franciscan friars were producing grammars of Nahuatl, remarkably detailed ones, actually. Fray Andrés de Olmos completed one of the earliest in 1547. These missionaries learned indigenous languages not out of respect for them, necessarily, but because they needed to convert people, and conversion required communication. But here's the thing. Even as they documented these languages, the colonial system was building the machinery that would marginalize them. Spanish became the language of law, of commerce, of the church hierarchy, of social advancement. If you wanted to own property, file a legal claim, participate in colonial society in any meaningful way, you needed Spanish. Your mother tongue became the language of the home, the village, the margins. And this pattern repeated everywhere. The Portuguese in Brazil, the French in West Africa, the Dutch in Indonesia, the British across a quarter of the globe. Each colonial power brought its language and installed it as the language of power. The mechanism was remarkably consistent, even when the colonial powers themselves were rivals who agreed on almost nothing else. Step 1. Establish administrative control. Step 2. Make the colonial language the language of government, courts, and trade. Step 3. Build schools, but only schools that teach in the colonial language. Step 4. Tie economic opportunity to fluency in that language. You don't need to ban indigenous languages outright, although sometimes they did that too. You just need to make them economically irrelevant. Within a few generations, parents start making a rational calculation. If my children are going to have any chance at a better life, they need to speak English, or French, or Spanish, and so they raise their children in the colonial language, and the indigenous language begins to fade. Now, the scale of what happened is staggering. Before European colonialism, the world had somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 distinct languages. We know this is a rough estimate. Nobody was counting precisely. But linguists working backward from what we know about language diversity and population patterns before contact put the number in that range. Today, we're down to about 7,000, but the distribution has shifted radically. A handful of languages, English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, French, Portuguese, are spoken by billions of people combined. Meanwhile, nearly half of the world's remaining languages have fewer than 10,000 speakers each. About a quarter have fewer than 1,000. And linguists estimate that a language dies, on average, roughly every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, the last fluent speaker of some language passes away, and with them goes an entire way of understanding and describing the world. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it's easy to hear a statistic like that and not really feel what it means. A language isn't just a set of vocabulary words and grammar rules. It's a complete cognitive framework. It contains within it a culture's accumulated observations about the natural world, its philosophical categories, its humor, its poetry, its way of parsing time and space and kinship. The Hopi language, spoken by the Hopi people in northeastern Arizona, famously structures time differently from English, though the exact nature of that difference has been debated by linguists since Benjamin Lee Horf wrote about it in the 1940s. The Gugu Yimithir language of northeastern Australia doesn't use relative spatial terms like left and right. Instead, speakers use cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, for everything, even describing which hand you're holding something in. As a result, Gugu Yimithir speakers maintain an extraordinary awareness of their orientation in space at all times. When a language like that disappears, it's not just words that are lost. It's a whole way of paying attention to reality. And this brings us to one of the most debated questions in linguistics, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named after Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Horf, both working in the early to mid-20th century. The strong version of their idea, sometimes called linguistic determinism, says that the language you speak determines how you think, that you literally cannot think thoughts that your language doesn't have words or structures for. Most linguists today reject that strong version. You can obviously think about concepts you don't have a single word for. You just describe them with more words. But the weaker version, called linguistic relativity, has gained a lot of ground in recent decades. It says that your language doesn't determine your thoughts, but it does influence them. It shapes your habits of attention, your default categories, the things you notice automatically versus the things you have to work to notice. And there's growing experimental evidence for this. Lara Boroditsky at UC San Diego has done fascinating work showing, for instance, that speakers of languages with grammatical gender, like Spanish or German, tend to associate gendered traits with inanimate objects. A bridge, which is feminine in German and masculine in Spanish, gets described differently by speakers of each language, even when they're speaking English. German speakers are more likely to call a bridge elegant or beautiful. Spanish speakers are more likely to call it strong or towering. The language is nudging perception in subtle but measurable ways. So when a language dies, something genuinely irreplaceable is lost, a unique lens on reality. And colonialism was, by far, the single largest driver of language death in human history. But here's what's important to understand. It wasn't always done through brute force. Sometimes it was. The residential school systems in Canada, the United States, and Australia are among the most painful examples. In Canada, the Indian residential school system operated from the 1880s through the 1990s. The last one didn't close until 1996, which is shockingly recent. Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and placed in boarding schools, often hundreds of miles from home, where they were forbidden from speaking their native languages. Children were punished, sometimes physically, for using the only language they knew when they arrived. The explicit goal, as one Canadian official infamously put it, was to kill the Indian in the child. Similar systems operated in the United States, where Captain Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 with the stated philosophy of kill the Indian, save the man. In Australia, the Stolen Generations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children removed from their families between roughly 1910 and 1970, faced the same linguistic severing. These weren't just educational policies. They were acts of cultural destruction, and their effects on language survival were devastating. Many indigenous languages in all three countries lost an entire generation of speakers, and some never recovered. But alongside these violent erasures, there was also the slower, quieter mechanism I described earlier. The economic gravity of the colonial language pulling speakers away from their mother tongues over generations. And this process didn't stop when colonialism officially ended. In fact, in many ways it accelerated. When former colonies gained independence in the 20th century, the great wave of decolonization sweeping through Asia and Africa in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the newly independent nations faced an immediate practical problem. Many of them contained dozens or even hundreds of distinct language groups within their borders. Nigeria alone has over 500 living languages. India has 447, depending on how you count. Papua New Guinea, a country of about 9 million people, has over 800, the highest linguistic diversity of any country on Earth. So when these nations needed a language for government, for courts, for national education, for diplomacy, they often chose, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes pragmatically, the colonial language. English became the official language of Nigeria, India, Kenya, Ghana. French became the official language of Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Portuguese remained the language of government in Mozambique and Angola, and the reasoning was practical, even if the consequences were painful. If you pick one indigenous language as the national language, you elevate one ethnic group above all others, which in a multi-ethnic post-colonial state can be politically explosive. The colonial language, paradoxically, was seen as neutral. It didn't belong to any one group within the country, precisely because it belonged to none of them. It was the language of the oppressor, yes, but it was everybody's oppressor equally, and so it became a kind of common ground. This is one of the strangest legacies of colonialism, that the languages imposed by empire became, in many cases, the languages that held post-colonial nations together. But that choice came at a cost. It meant that indigenous languages continued to be marginalized in education and public life, even after independence. Children in rural Nigeria or Senegal or India might grow up speaking their mother tongue at home, but receive all their schooling in English or French, a language they might barely understand when they first walk into a classroom. The educational consequences are significant. There's substantial research showing that children learn best, especially in the early years, when they're taught in their mother tongue. And yet the economic incentives continue to point toward the global languages. English, in particular, has become the undisputed lingua franca of international business, science, technology, aviation, diplomacy, and the Internet. Its dominance isn't just a legacy of the British Empire. It was massively amplified by American economic and cultural power in the 20th century. By Hollywood, by Silicon Valley, by the fact that the Internet was born in English, and a huge proportion of its content remains in English. And this is where the story of language meets the story of technology in a new way, because the digital age has created both unprecedented threats to linguistic diversity and unprecedented tools for fighting back. Think about what the Internet does to language. On one hand, it's a homogenizing force. It rewards the big languages, the ones with the most content, the most users, the most economic power. If you want to participate in the global digital economy, you need one of a handful of languages, and English above all. Algorithms, search engines, social media platforms, they all work better in major languages because that's where the data is, and data is what drives these systems. On the other hand, the same technology gives small language communities tools that they've never had before. You can create a dictionary app for a language spoken by 3,000 people. You can record elders telling stories and make those recordings available to young people anywhere in the world. You can build keyboards and input systems for scripts that no typewriter ever supported. The Endangered Languages Project, launched in 2012 with support from Google, has become a clearinghouse for documentation and revitalization efforts. And there are remarkable success stories. Languages that were on the brink of extinction that have been pulled back through determined community effort and smart use of technology. The most famous example is probably Hebrew, though that story is unusual in many ways. Hebrew effectively ceased to be a spoken everyday language sometime around the 2nd century CE, surviving for nearly 2 millennia as a liturgical and literary language. Jews read it, prayed in it, wrote in it, but didn't use it to ask someone to pass the salt. Then, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, largely through the efforts of one extraordinarily determined man named Eliezer ben Yehuda, Hebrew was revived as a living spoken language. Ben Yehuda moved to Palestine in 1881 and insisted on speaking only Hebrew in his household. His son, Ben Zion, became arguably the first native speaker of modern Hebrew in centuries. Ben Yehuda compiled dictionaries, coined new words for modern concepts, and campaigned tirelessly for Hebrew to be the language of the growing Jewish community in Palestine. When Israel was established in 1948, Hebrew became one of its official languages, and today it's spoken by about 9 million people as a first language. It's the only example in history of a language being fully revived from non-vernacular use to everyday speech on a national scale. But most revitalization stories are more modest and more fragile. Welsh is often cited as a qualified success. Aggressive language policies in Wales, including mandatory Welsh language education, Welsh language television, and legal requirements for bilingual public signage, have stabilized the number of Welsh speakers at around 560,000, roughly 20% of the population. It's not growing dramatically, but it's not dying either. And for a language that was in steep decline through much of the 20th century, that counts as a victory. Maori in New Zealand, Irish in Ireland, Basque in Spain and France, Hawaiian in Hawaii. All are the subjects of active revitalization efforts with varying degrees of success. The common thread in the cases that work is that revitalization requires more than just documentation. You can record every word, every grammar rule, every song and story, and still lose the language if children don't grow up speaking it. A language lives in the mouths of children, or it doesn't live at all. And this brings us to something that linguists have been grappling with intensely in recent decades: the question of what, exactly, we should do about language death. Is it a tragedy to be fought at all costs? Or is it a natural process, like species extinction, that has always been part of human history? Because languages have always died. Long before colonialism, languages were born, evolved, split, merged, and disappeared. That's how we got from Proto-Indo-European to the 445 or so Indo-European languages spoken today, through millennia of splitting and diverging, and yes, dying. The difference now is the rate. The current rate of language loss is estimated to be many times higher than the historical baseline, and the primary drivers, colonialism, globalization, urbanization, mass media, the internet, are all accelerating. Some linguists predict that by the end of this century, between 50 and 90% of the world's languages will have fallen silent. Even the conservative end of that estimate means the loss of thousands of unique human perspectives, thousands of ways of seeing the world, categorizing experience, encoding knowledge about plants and animals and weather and human relationships that exist nowhere else. And that's what makes this moment different from any previous era of language loss. It's not just the number, it's the speed, and it's the fact that we're aware of it while it's happening. So what do you do with that awareness? That's the question. And it's genuinely hard, because there are real tensions here, and honest people disagree. On one side, you have linguists and activists who argue that every language death is an irreversible catastrophe. They compare it to biodiversity loss. When a species goes extinct, you lose not just that organism, but its entire evolutionary lineage, its unique adaptations, its relationships with other species. When a language dies, you lose a unique cognitive framework, a unique oral literature, a unique repository of ecological and cultural knowledge. You lose something that took thousands of years to develop and that can never be reconstructed. And they point out that language death is almost never truly voluntary. It's the result of coercion, marginalization, economic pressure, and the systematic devaluation of minority cultures. People don't freely choose to abandon their mother tongue. They're pushed. On the other side, you have people who argue that language shift is a rational response to real-world conditions. If speaking the dominant language gives your children better economic opportunities, better access to education and healthcare, a wider social world, isn't it paternalistic to tell those parents they should be raising their kids in a language that limits their prospects? This argument has teeth, and you can't just wave it away. There's a real tension between preserving cultural heritage and respecting individual agency. But here's the thing, and this is where the conversation gets more nuanced than either side sometimes allows. Those two positions aren't actually as opposed as they seem. Almost nobody serious is arguing that minority language speakers should be forced to keep speaking their language against their will. And almost nobody serious is arguing that it's fine for governments and institutions to actively suppress minority languages. The real question is about creating conditions. Can you build a world where speaking Navajo or Yoruba or Quechua doesn't come at an economic cost? Can you create educational systems where children become bilingual or multilingual, gaining the dominant language without losing their heritage language? Because bilingualism isn't a zero-sum game. The human brain is spectacularly good at handling multiple languages. Most humans throughout most of history have been multilingual. The idea that you need to abandon one language to learn another is actually a relatively modern myth, and it's one that was deliberately promoted by exactly the kind of assimilationist policies we talked about earlier. And this is where technology re-enters the story in a fascinating way. Because the same digital infrastructure that has turbocharged the spread of English and Mandarin and Spanish, the same internet that makes it so easy to consume content in dominant languages, is also being repurposed as a tool for language preservation and revitalization. And some of what's happening is genuinely remarkable. Think about what it takes to document a language. A generation ago, a linguist would travel to a remote community, spend months or years there, fill notebooks with vocabulary and grammar rules, maybe record some audio on a tape recorder. That work was invaluable, but it was slow, expensive, and limited. The resulting materials often ended up in university archives, inaccessible to the very communities whose language had been documented. Now think about what's possible with a smartphone. A community member, not an outside linguist, but someone who actually speaks the language, can record hours of natural conversation, songs, stories, ceremonies. They can create dictionaries, grammar guides, children's books, all in digital formats that can be shared instantly with anyone in the world. Apps like those built for Ojibwe, Cherokee, and dozens of other indigenous languages let children learn vocabulary through games on their parents' phones. YouTube channels in minority languages create content that kids actually want to watch. Social media platforms become spaces where young people use their heritage language in casual, everyday contexts, texting, posting, commenting, which is exactly the kind of informal daily use that keeps a language alive. There's a project called Endangered Languages, originally supported by Google, that created an online platform where speakers of endangered languages could upload recordings, texts, and other materials. The Internet Archive and various university partnerships have digitized thousands of hours of recordings from languages with only a handful of remaining speakers. In some cases, these recordings are the only remaining evidence that a language ever existed. In others, they're being used as teaching materials for new learners. And then there are the more ambitious technological interventions: machine learning and natural language processing. The same technologies behind things like auto-translate and voice assistants are being adapted for minority languages. This is harder than it sounds, because these systems typically need enormous amounts of training data, and by definition, endangered languages don't have much data available. But researchers are developing techniques that work with smaller data sets, and some of the results are promising. There are now speech recognition systems for languages spoken by only a few thousand people. There are machine translation tools being built for languages that have never had a written form. The technology isn't perfect. It's often rough, sometimes comically wrong. But it's improving, and more importantly, it signals that these languages are worth investing in. That signal matters. But let's be honest about the limitations too. Technology can document a language. It can create learning tools. It can make a language visible in digital spaces where it was previously absent. What it cannot do is replace the fundamental social conditions that keep a language alive. A language needs a community of speakers. It needs contexts where it's the natural, default choice: homes, workplaces, markets, playgrounds. It needs prestige, or at least the absence of stigma. No app can create those conditions. Technology is a tool, and like all tools, it's only as effective as the social and political will behind it. And this is where policy comes in. Some of the most effective language revitalization efforts have been driven not by technology or even by grassroots activism alone, but by deliberate government policy. New Zealand's Maori Language Act of 1987 made Maori an official language and established the Maori Language Commission. Wales's Welsh Language Act of 1993, later strengthened by the Welsh Language Measure of 2011, required public services to be available in Welsh and created the office of the Welsh Language Commissioner. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They create real institutional infrastructure. When you can interact with your government in your language, when your children can attend school in your language, when road signs and official documents and court proceedings use your language, it sends a powerful message. This language belongs here. It has authority. It has a future. The European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, adopted by the Council of Europe in 1992, provides a framework for protecting and promoting minority languages across the continent. Not all countries have ratified it. France notably has signed but never ratified, partly because the French Constitution enshrines French as the sole language of the Republic. But where it has been implemented, it's made a measurable difference. Catalan in Spain, Sami languages in Scandinavia, Frisian in the Netherlands, all benefit from various levels of official recognition and institutional support. But here's what's really interesting about all of this. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, the full arc of language from those first proto-linguistic utterances on the African savanna to the 7,000 languages spoken today to the projected losses of this century. What you see is not just a story about communication, it's a story about power. It has always been a story about power. Who gets to speak, and in what language, and whose language is taught in schools, and used in courts, and printed in books, and broadcast on airwaves, and indexed by search engines. These are not neutral, technical questions. They are deeply political questions, and they always have been. Think about it. When the Akkadian Empire spread across Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, Akkadian became the language of administration and diplomacy, and Sumerian, one of the world's first written languages, gradually faded from everyday use, surviving only as a scholarly and liturgical language, a bit like Latin in medieval Europe. The pattern repeats across millennia: Greek under Alexander, Latin under Rome, Arabic following the Islamic conquests, Persian in the Mughal courts, French as the language of European diplomacy for centuries. English now. The mechanism is always the same. Political and economic power makes a language useful, and usefulness drives adoption, and adoption drives prestige, and prestige drives further adoption, and the cycle feeds itself until the dominant language seems not just useful, but inevitable, natural, the way things should be, and the languages that lose out in this process, the ones that get pushed to the margins, confined to the home, to the elderly, to ceremonial contexts, they don't just quietly disappear. They carry with them entire ways of thinking, entire bodies of knowledge, entire literary and oral traditions. When the last speaker of a language dies, it's not just a vocabulary list that vanishes, it's a world view. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but isn't this just how history works? Languages come and go. The world changes. You can't freeze culture in amber. And that's true. You really can't. But there's a difference between a language evolving naturally, splitting into dialects that become new languages, borrowing words, shifting grammar, and a language being actively crushed by policies designed to eliminate it. There's a difference between change and destruction. And much of the language loss we're seeing today falls closer to the destruction end of that spectrum. So where does that leave us? In a strange and unprecedented moment, actually. We are the first generation in human history that has both the awareness and the tools to do something about language loss on a global scale. We have recording technology, digital archives, machine learning, global communication networks, and a growing body of knowledge about what makes revitalization efforts succeed or fail. We also have, and this is crucial, a growing recognition among linguists, educators, and policymakers that linguistic diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be cherished. But awareness and tools aren't enough without will, and will requires understanding. It requires people like you, lying here in the dark, listening to this, to grasp why it matters that there are languages in the Amazon basin with evidential markers that require speakers to specify how they know what they're claiming, or languages in Australia with absolute spatial reference systems that give their speakers an almost superhuman sense of direction, or languages in Papua New Guinea with counting systems based on body parts that encode mathematical concepts in ways that Western mathematics never considered. These aren't curiosities. These are human achievements. Each one represents a unique solution to the universal human problem of how to make meaning out of experience. And that brings us to something that might seem like a completely different topic, but is actually deeply connected. The question of what happens to language itself in an age of artificial intelligence. Because while we've been talking about the loss of human languages, something else has been quietly happening. Something that would have seemed like pure science fiction even 30 years ago. Machines that can read, write, translate, and even generate language, not by understanding it the way you and I do, but by doing something else entirely, something that forces us to ask a question we never really had to ask before. What is language actually at its deepest level? Is it thought made audible? Is it a social tool? Or is it, at bottom, just pattern? Incredibly complex, statistically rich pattern that a sufficiently powerful machine can mimic without ever knowing what any of it means. Let's sit with that for a moment, because it's a genuinely strange question, and the answer isn't as obvious as you might think. The story of machines and language goes back further than most people realize. In the 1950s, right at the dawn of the computing age, one of the very first practical tasks people tried to throw at computers was translation. The logic seemed straightforward. Language has rules, grammar, syntax, vocabulary. Computers are good at following rules. So you just encode the rules of one language, encode the rules of another, map the vocabulary, and let the machine do the rest. This was the basic idea behind what's called rule-based machine translation, and the early enthusiasm was enormous. In 1954, Georgetown University and IBM did a public demonstration where a computer translated 60 Russian sentences into English. The press coverage was breathless. Experts predicted that machine translation would be essentially solved within 3 to 5 years. It was not solved within 3 to 5 years. It turned out that language is vastly, almost incomprehensibly more complex than a set of rules and a dictionary. Think about a sentence as simple as, "Time flies like an arrow." Seems clear enough, right? But a computer trying to parse that has to deal with the fact that time could be a noun or a verb, flies could be a verb or a noun, like could be a preposition or a verb, and the whole sentence could mean at least 3 different things. Time passes quickly, the way an arrow does. Or there's a species of fly called time flies that are fond of arrows. Or you should time the flies in the same way you would time an arrow. You and I resolve this ambiguity instantly, without even noticing it's there, because we have context, world knowledge, common sense, and a lifetime of experience with how people actually talk. A computer in 1954 had none of that. By 1966, the ALPAC report, a study commissioned by the US government, concluded that machine translation was nowhere near practical and recommended cutting funding. The field went into what people sometimes call an AI winter, at least for translation. It didn't die completely, but progress was painfully slow for decades. What changed everything was a completely different approach. Instead of trying to teach machines the rules of language, researchers in the late 1980s, and especially the 1990s, started feeding machines enormous quantities of text and letting them figure out the patterns on their own. This is statistical machine translation, and the key insight was almost absurdly simple. You don't need to understand language to translate it. You just need enough examples of sentences that humans have already translated, and you can learn which words and phrases tend to correspond to which other words and phrases. The more data you have, the better the statistical correlations and the better the output. Google Translate launched in 2006 using essentially this approach, and while the early results were often hilariously bad, mangled grammar, nonsensical word choices, sentences that technically contained the right vocabulary but meant something completely different from the original, it was also genuinely useful in a way that nothing before it had been. You could paste in a paragraph of Portuguese or Japanese or Arabic and get something that, while rough, gave you a real sense of what the text was about. Millions of people started using it every day, and every time they did, every time they suggested a correction or chose an alternative translation, the system got a little bit better. But the real revolution, the one that's happening right now, the one that's reshaping our relationship with language in ways we're only beginning to understand, came with neural networks and what's called deep learning. In 2017, a team at Google published a paper with the unassuming title, "Attention is All You Need," and it introduced something called the transformer architecture. This is the foundation of every large language model you've heard of: GPT, Claude, Gemini, all of them. And what these models do is genuinely remarkable. They're trained on essentially the entire written internet, billions of documents, trillions of words, and they learn to predict what comes next in a sequence of text. That's it, at the most basic level. Given everything that's come before in a sentence, what word is most likely to come next? Here's the thing, though. When you do that prediction task at sufficient scale, with enough data and enough computational power, something unexpected happens. The model doesn't just learn which words follow which other words. It learns grammar. It learns style. It learns factual associations. It learns to reason, or at least to produce outputs that look remarkably like reasoning. It can write poetry, explain quantum mechanics, draft legal contracts, tell jokes, and carry on conversations that feel, and this is the key word, feel, genuinely intelligent. But does it understand? That's the question that haunts this whole enterprise, and it connects directly to everything we've been talking about tonight, because it forces us to confront what we mean by language in the first place. Think back to what we talked about earlier, the way different languages encode different ways of seeing the world, the Pirahã and their relationship with number, the Gugu Yimithir and their absolute spatial orientation, the Turkish evidential markers that require you to say how you know something every time you make a claim. These aren't just surface features, they're deep cognitive structures that shape how speakers think, perceive, and interact with reality. When a large language model generates text in English, it's producing statistically plausible sequences of English words. It can even generate text in Mandarin or Arabic or Swahili, because those languages are in its training data. But it's not thinking in any of those languages. It's not thinking at all in the way that you're thinking right now. It has no body, no culture, no childhood, no community. It has never pointed at a bird and learned the word for it from its mother. It has never felt the frustration of not being able to express what it means, or the joy of finding exactly the right word. And yet, and this is where it gets genuinely complicated, these models are already changing how humans use language. Think about how many emails, reports, social media posts, and even news articles are now drafted or edited by AI. Think about how many students are using these tools to write essays, how many businesses are using them to generate marketing copy, how many people are using them to communicate in languages they don't actually speak. The text that these models produce tends to converge on a particular style, clear, competent, slightly generic, often in English or English-inflected patterns, even when producing other languages. There's a kind of linguistic homogenization happening, a flattening of the wild diversity of human expression into something more uniform, more predictable, more machine-like. Now, you might be thinking, so what? If the communication works, if people understand each other, does it matter if the prose is a little bland? And that's a fair question. But remember what we talked about. Language isn't just a tool for transmitting information. It's a way of being in the world, its identity, its culture, its cognition. When the default mode of written communication becomes AI-generated English, the languages and styles and voices that don't fit that mold become even more marginalized than they already are. A language that was already struggling to maintain its presence online because its speakers are few, because there's no standardized keyboard layout, because the tech companies never built support for its script, now has to compete not just with dominant human languages, but with an infinitely productive machine that generates dominant language text at zero marginal cost. But here's the other side of that coin, and it's important. The same technology that threatens linguistic diversity also offers genuinely powerful tools for preserving it. Remember those machine learning systems we talked about that can work with small data sets? They're getting better, fast. Researchers are using transformer models to build speech recognition systems for endangered languages, to create dictionaries and grammar tools, to transcribe hours of recorded speech from elderly speakers who are the last fluent voices of their language. A project at the University of Colorado has used AI to help document and analyze languages of the Pacific Northwest. Google's Woolaroo project uses image recognition to teach vocabulary in endangered languages. You point your phone at an object and it tells you the word in Ugambe or Maori or Nahuatl. These are small efforts compared to the scale of the problem, but they represent something genuinely new. The ability to leverage computational power in service of linguistic diversity rather than against it. And translation itself, the thing that started this whole computational linguistics journey back in the 1950s, is becoming something different than anyone expected. Real-time translation earbuds exist now. You can have a conversation with someone who speaks a completely different language, and the technology mediates between you, translating in near real time with reasonable accuracy. On one hand, this is extraordinary. It breaks down barriers, enables communication, connects people. On the other hand, it potentially removes one of the most powerful motivations for learning another language, the simple, practical need to communicate. And when people stop learning each other's languages, something is lost that a machine can never replace. The experience of inhabiting another linguistic world, of feeling your thoughts reshape themselves around different grammatical structures, of understanding a joke that only works in French or a concept that only exists in Japanese. There's a Japanese word, komorebi, that means the sunlight filtering through leaves. There's a Portuguese word, saudade, for a deep emotional state of nostalgic longing for something or someone absent. There's a Finnish word, kalsarikanet, that means drinking alone at home in your underwear with no intention of going out. You can translate these words, you can explain them, but the explanation is never quite the same as having the word, having it live in your mouth, having it be the natural, effortless way you describe a particular experience. That's what a language gives you. Not just labels for things, but a whole way of carving up reality. A whole set of concepts that feel obvious and natural and inevitable, even though speakers of other languages might never have thought to make those particular distinctions. So here we are, at the end of a very long story, a story that stretches back at least 100,000 years, probably more, to a time when some group of early humans in Africa began doing something that no other species had ever done. They began to talk, not just to signal danger or food or mating availability, the way other animals do, but to talk, to share ideas, to tell stories, to plan for the future, to argue about the past, to gossip, to joke, to lie, to comfort, to inspire. And from that improbable beginning, language exploded into the thousands of distinct systems that humans have created, each one a masterwork of complexity, each one perfectly adapted to the needs and environment and culture of its speakers. each one carrying within it a unique record of human experience. We traced how those spoken languages eventually gave rise to writing, those first tentative marks on clay tablets in Mesopotamia, the slow realization that you could capture speech and make it permanent, make it travel across distance and time. We watched as alphabets evolved and spread, as printing shattered the old monopolies on knowledge, as standardization created national languages but crushed local ones. We saw how colonial powers weaponized language, how children were torn from their families and punished for speaking their mother tongues, how entire linguistic traditions were driven to the edge of extinction in just a few generations. And we saw the other side too, the extraordinary resilience of communities who refused to let their languages die. The Hebrew revival, maybe the most improbable linguistic success story in human history, the Welsh schools, the Maori language nests, the Cherokee syllabary on smartphones, the Ojibwe apps, the patient work of elders sitting with linguists and recording devices, making sure that something of their language would survive, even if the worst happened. You know, there's something deeply human about all of this. Language is the most human thing there is. It's the one capacity that truly separates us from every other species on this planet. Not tool use, not social organization, not even culture in the broadest sense, because other animals have versions of all those things. But language, real language, with its infinite generativity, its recursive structure, its ability to talk about things that don't exist, things that happened long ago, things that might never happen. That's ours. That's the thing we do. And every time a language disappears, every time the last speaker of Ayak or Boasir or Klallam draws their final breath and takes with them a way of seeing the world that existed nowhere else, we lose something that can never be recovered. Not just words, not just grammar, but a piece of the human story, a thread in the vast tapestry of what our species has thought and felt and figured out over the course of 100,000 years of talking to each other. But here's what I want to leave you with, as you lie there in the dark, maybe still listening, maybe already drifting off into sleep. The story isn't over. It's never over. Language is alive, and living things change, adapt, evolve, surprise you. New languages are being born right now. Creoles forming in cities where dozens of immigrant communities mix. Sign languages emerging spontaneously wherever deaf children come together. Internet dialects and slang evolving at a pace that would make a historical linguist's head spin. The human impulse to communicate, to connect, to make meaning. That impulse is as strong as it has ever been. Stronger, maybe, because there are more of us now, more connected, more aware of each other than at any point in history. And somewhere tonight, right now, a grandmother is singing a lullaby in a language that only a few hundred people speak. And a child is hearing those words, absorbing them, letting them settle into the deep architecture of their developing brain, where they'll live for a lifetime. And that child will grow up and maybe teach those words to their own children. Or maybe they won't. But either way, right now, in this moment, that language is alive. It's doing what language has always done. It's carrying human experience from one mind to another, across the small, dark space between two people who love each other. That's what language is. That's what it's always been. And that, more than anything else, is why it matters. So let that thought settle. Let it be the last thing on your mind as you drift off. The sound of a human voice carrying meaning through the dark. The oldest technology, the most powerful one, yours and everyone's and no one's. just breath shaped into meaning, traveling from me to you, the way it's traveled between humans for 100,000 years. Sleep well.